She found the notice pinned to the board outside the Great Hall, between a tax decree and a weather advisory, as if the end of her world deserved no more ceremony than a grain report. The wax seal was still warm. Someone had posted it less than an hour ago, and the ink glistened under the corridor torchlight like something alive. Elowin Voss read it once, then again, then a third time, because her mind kept rejecting the words even as her eyes traced every one. His Royal Majesty Soren Valdric, Alpha King of Ashenmere, and Lady Lysara Ashworth of the Eastern Reach are hereby joined in formal betrothal. The bonding ceremony shall take place on the first night of the frost moon. Her hand moved to her stomach before she could stop it. The swell was barely visible beneath her loose linen tunic, still easy to hide if she was careful. 4 months. She was 4 months along, and no one knew. Not Era, who noticed everything. Not the kitchen staff, who had started giving her curious looks when she turned pale at the smell of salted pork every morning. And certainly not him. Not the king. Not the father. She pressed her palm flat against the stone wall to keep herself standing. The cold seeped through her skin and settled somewhere beneath her ribs, but it was nothing compared to the cold already spreading through her chest. A slow, creeping frost that started behind her heart and moved outward until her fingers went numb and her breath came thin and shallow. She could still feel the ghost of his hands on her waist from 3 nights ago. The low, rough way he whispered her name in the dark, like it was something fragile and entirely his. Elowin. He said it differently than anyone else in the world. He said it like she mattered. She stared at the engagement notice until the letters blurred and rearranged themselves into meaningless shapes. Lysara Ashworth. She knew the name. Every person in the kingdom knew the name. The Ashworth bloodline controlled the Eastern Reach, the largest territory outside the Crown Lands, and their military alliance had kept Ashenmere's eastern border secure for 3 generations. Lady Lysara herself was said to be beautiful, sharp-tongued and politically brilliant, the kind of woman who was built for a throne. And Elowin was a healer, a nobody with no surname worth claiming, no family crest, no lands, no title, no seat at any table that mattered. She mixed medicines, stitched wounds, and slept in a room the size of a wardrobe in the servants' wing. She owned 2 spare dresses and a leather herb pouch, and nothing else of value in the world except the secret growing quietly beneath her ribs. She had been foolish enough to believe that none of it mattered to him, that the way he held her, the way his wolf pressed against hers when they were close, the way he once traced the line of her jaw with his thumb and murmured, "I didn't know it was possible to need someone this much," meant something that outweighed politics and bloodlines and centuries of tradition. The notice said otherwise. She didn't cry. That would come later, she knew, in great heaving waves that would leave her hollowed out and gasping. But right now, her body had entered a state beyond tears. A kind of frozen clarity that felt almost like calm if she didn't examine it too closely. Her healer's mind took over, clinical and efficient, cataloging the situation the way she would catalog symptoms. The king was marrying someone else. She was carrying his child. He did not know about the child. And if he found out, what then? She would become a complication, a scandal. A nameless girl with an inconvenient belly who threatened the most important political alliance in a generation. She imagined telling him and watching his face change. Imagined the silence stretching between them. Imagined being moved to some quiet estate in the countryside where she could deliver the child in secrecy while Lysara Ashworth wore his ring and sat beside him at banquets and gave him legitimate heirs with the right surname attached. No. She would not be someone's hidden shame. She walked back to her room. The corridor was empty. She packed methodically, her hands steady even as something inside her chest cracked and kept cracking with every item she folded. 2 spare dresses, her herb pouch, the small leather journal she used for patient notes, a vial of prenatal tonic she had taken quietly from Era's supply shelf, hidden among her own remedies for weeks. She left behind the silver hairpin he had given her. She left behind the dried sprig of night bloom he had tucked behind her ear one evening and told her to keep because it matched her eyes. She left behind every small, tender artifact of what they had been because carrying them would make the leaving impossible. The palace had 17 exits. Elowyn knew this because she had spent 4 years treating guards who injured themselves on shift, and every single one of them loved to complain about their assigned gate. The southeast passage through the old granary went unguarded between the 2nd and 4th hour of the morning, when the night watch rotated and the incoming shift stopped at the kitchen for bread and broth before assuming their posts. She waited. She sat on the edge of her narrow cot with her bag in her lap and her hands pressed together and counted the slow, unbearable minutes until the 3rd hour. Then she stood, pulled her cloak tight around her shoulders, and walked out of the only home she had ever known. The air outside the palace walls was sharp with late autumn frost. Her breath clouded in front of her, and the grass crunched beneath her boots like something breaking with every step. She did not look back. She did not let herself glance at the tower window where his chambers sat dark and still, where the Alpha King of Ashenmere slept without knowing that the woman carrying his child had just walked out of his life, without a sound. The road north wound through the green Vale forest. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched the treetops, Elowyn Voss was gone. No note, no explanation, no trail. And she had no way of knowing that when Soren Valdrick woke that morning and reached for the empty side of his bed, he would not stop reaching. 4 months earlier, Elowyn Voss had not yet learned what it felt like to love someone who would never choose her in the light. She was 23 years old, orphaned at birth, raised in the palace infirmary by Mistress Heir, the head healer whose sharp tongue and even sharper instincts had kept Ashenmere's court alive through 2 plagues and a border war. Elowyn had been left on the infirmary doorstep as a newborn, wrapped in an unmarked wool blanket with no note and no name pinned to it. Heir had taken one look at the silent, wide-eyed infant and said, "Fine, but she's learning to work as soon as she can hold a mortar." And she had. By 12, Elowyn could identify 70 herbs by scent alone. By 16, she could set a fractured bone cleanly enough that the patient barely flinched. By 20, she was the most skilled herbalist in the palace, though no one outside the infirmary walls knew her name because Elowyn had spent her entire life perfecting the art of not being noticed. It was safer that way. Foundlings without families learned early that visibility invited judgment. If people noticed you, they formed opinions. If they formed opinions, they decided you didn't belong. So Elowyn kept her head down, did her work with quiet precision, and made herself small enough to survive in a world that had never made room for her. The king changed everything. She met him on a night in late spring, when the palace was quiet and the infirmary was empty except for her. She had been grinding valerian root at the workbench, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, humming something tuneless and cheerfully off-key, when the door opened and a man walked in bleeding from a gash across his forearm. She hadn't recognized him. Not immediately. He was wearing a plain linen shirt with no insignia, his dark hair disheveled, his jaw clenched against pain he was clearly too stubborn to admit. She assumed he was a soldier from the night patrol who had caught himself on something sharp and was too proud to seek proper treatment during daylight hours. "Sit down," she had said without looking up. "And stop clenching your fists like that. You're making it bleed faster." He had stared at her. She had felt his gaze but hadn't thought much of it, because soldiers always stared when a woman gave them orders they weren't expecting. "How did you cut yourself?" she had asked, pulling clean gauze and a tincture bottle from the shelf. "Sparring," he had said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that never needed to raise itself because the world leaned in to listen anyway. Sparring, at this hour. She had finally looked up. And then she had frozen, because the man sitting on her treatment table with blood dripping down his wrist was not a member of the night patrol. He was Soren Valdrick, the Alpha King of Ashenmere. The most feared wolf in the realm, sitting in her infirmary in a blood-stained shirt at midnight with an expression that dared her to make a fuss about it. She had not made a fuss. She was far too terrified to make a fuss. Her hands trembled as she cleaned the wound, but she cleaned it properly. And when she applied the healing salve, she did it with the same firm, steady touch she used on every patient regardless of who they were. "You're not afraid of me," he had observed. "I am extremely afraid of you," she had replied honestly. "But the wound doesn't care who you are, and neither does the infection you'll get if I don't clean it." Something had shifted in his expression then. A crack in the granite, so brief she might have imagined it. And when she had finished bandaging his arm, he hadn't left. He had stayed, sitting in the warm lamplight while she cleaned her instruments, and asked her name. "Elowyn," she had said. "Elowyn," he had repeated, and the sound of her own name in his mouth had done something dangerous and irreversible to her heart. He came back the next night, and the night after. Not injured, not ill, just present. He sat in her infirmary and read his reports while she worked, and then he started asking questions about the herbs, about her patients, about the small, unremarkable details of her life that no one had ever found worth knowing. She told him about the time she accidentally brewed a cough remedy so potent it made a stable hand sneeze without stopping for 3 days straight. He had laughed, a short, startled sound, like he had forgotten that laughing was something his body could do. She told him about growing up in the infirmary, about Heir's relentless training, about the years of making herself invisible because it was the only way she knew to survive. He had gone very still at that, his jaw tightening in a way that told her his anger wasn't directed at her. It was directed at every person who had ever made her feel she needed to disappear. The first time he kissed her, it was 3 weeks after that first night. She had been reaching past him for a jar on a high shelf, stretching on her toes with her arm extended, and he had caught her wrist gently and pulled her down and kissed her, like he had been holding his breath for days, and she was the only air left in the room. "This is a terrible idea," she had whispered against his mouth. "Yes," he had agreed and kissed her again. It became their secret. Nights in the infirmary after the palace went dark. Nights in the hidden passage behind the old library where no one wandered after the lamps were snuffed. He was intense and possessive and devastating in his tenderness, a gentleness so thorough it undid her slowly and completely. He memorized the scar on her left hand from a childhood burn. He brought her rare herbs from the mountain traders and left them on her workbench without a note, because he knew she would recognize his scent on the wrapping. And she fell. Quietly, completely, without a single net beneath her. But he never spoke of tomorrow. He never mentioned her name at court. He never acknowledged what they were in any room that contained another living soul. And Elowyn, who had spent her entire life accepting crumbs and calling them enough, did not ask him for more. She should have. The first whisper about the Eastern Reach arrived at the infirmary on a humid morning in late summer. Heir was treating a council member for gout, and the old man talked freely, as patients always did when they were in enough pain to forget discretion. The Eastern Reach was threatening to withdraw military support from the border. Lord Ashworth, the territory's aging patriarch, had made his terms brutally clear. A marriage alliance with the Crown or the Eastern Garrison would be recalled within 6 months. Without the Ashworth forces, the border collapsed. Without the border, the wildlands poured in. It was that simple and that final. Elowyn had listened from behind the supply curtain where she was sorting inventory, her hand pausing over a bundle of dried chamomile. A marriage alliance. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself the king would find another way, because he always found another way. Because he was Sorin, and the rules didn't apply to him the way they applied to everyone else. Then Lysara Ashworth arrived at the palace. She rode through the main gates on a silver mare, flanked by 12 mounted guards in the Ashworth colors of jade and iron. Elowyn watched from the infirmary window as the courtyard erupted with activity below. Servants scrambled into formation, Banners bearing the Ashworth crest were raised alongside the Valdric standard. The welcoming party was twice the size of anything she had ever seen assembled for a visiting dignitary. Lysara was tall and striking, with dark auburn hair braided in the military style of the Eastern Territories, and a bearing that suggested she had been raised not to enter rooms, but to command them. She dismounted with the practiced grace of someone who had been on horseback since childhood, and when King Soren stepped forward to greet her, she met his gaze without flinching. No curtsy, no deference. An equal addressing an equal. Elowin's stomach lurched so violently she had to grip the windowsill. "Close the window," Era said quietly from behind her. Elowin closed it. Over the following weeks, Lysara became a permanent fixture in the palace. She attended council meetings, something no visiting dignitary had done in living memory. She dined at the king's table every evening. She walked the grounds with him in the long golden afternoons, and servants whispered in corridors about how natural they looked together. How well matched. How inevitable. Elowin saw them once, crossing the courtyard at dusk. Lysara was mid-sentence, her expression animated, her hands gesturing with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. And Soren was listening to her with a focused intensity he normally reserved for war briefings. He didn't smile. He almost never smiled. But his posture was open and engaged in a way that Elowin recognized deep in her bones, because he used to stand that way with her. She dug her fingernails into her palms hard enough to leave crescent marks and turned away before either of them could notice her watching. That same week, the nausea worsened. Mornings became unbearable. Certain smells, meat, candle smoke, the iron tang of blood, sent her rushing to the basin behind the supply curtain. She was exhausted by midday, and her body felt strange in ways she could not pretend away any longer, aching and shifting and changing in ways that had nothing to do with illness and everything to do with the life taking shape inside her. She knew, she had known for weeks, if she was honest with herself, she was a trained healer. She understood what these signs meant. But knowing and confirming were very different things, and confirming meant the situation became real in a way she could never undo. She brewed the test herself, alone, well past midnight, with the infirmary doors locked and the curtains drawn. The old method Era had taught her years ago. 3 drops of her blood added to a mixture of moonwort extract and crushed iron filings, then wait for the color to change. If the solution stayed clear, there was nothing. If it turned blue, it turned blue. Elowin sat on the floor of the infirmary storeroom with her back pressed against the shelves and her arms wrapped tight around her knees, and tried to remember how breathing was supposed to work. A child, his child, growing inside her while his future wife walked the palace halls and the court prepared a wedding that would seal the fate of the entire kingdom. She considered telling him. She rehearsed the words in her head for days, standing in front of the small cracked mirror in her room at night, watching her own lips move. "Your Majesty, I need to speak with you privately." Too formal. He would know immediately that something was wrong. "Soren, there is something you need to know." Better. But then what? She imagined his face, the way his expression would close like a door slamming shut. The way the warmth would drain from his eyes as the political reality crashed over him. An illegitimate child with a nameless palace healer, discovered weeks before his strategic marriage to the most powerful family in the Eastern Territories. She would become a problem to be managed, and the child would become a secret to be buried. The decision not to tell him crystallized on a Thursday evening when she overheard him speaking with Hadrian in the corridor outside the infirmary. She had not meant to listen. The door was ajar, their voices low but clear enough to carry in the stillness. "The bonding ceremony will take place on the first night of the frost moon," Soren had said. His voice was flat and perfectly controlled, like a man reading terms of surrender. "See that the preparations are handled discreetly. I want no spectacle." "And what about—" Hadrian had paused, choosing his words with visible care. "Personal matters, Your Majesty." A silence that lasted long enough for Elowen's heart to beat 5 times. Then, "There are no personal matters. There is only the kingdom. There are no personal matters." Elowen had pressed her hand against her mouth so hard her teeth cut into her lip. She had stood motionless in the darkened infirmary until their footsteps faded down the corridor, until she was absolutely certain she was alone, until the pain in her chest had dulled from a scream into something she could breathe around without making a sound. That night, she found the engagement notice on the board outside the great hall, and the stillness descended, cold and final. And she packed her bag and counted the hours and walked out through the unguarded granary passage and did not look back. Because she would not raise her child in the shadow of a man who called what they had a personal matter to be discarded, and she would not teach her child that love meant waiting in the dark for someone who would never step into the light beside you. The morning she disappeared, Soren Valdrick woke reaching for warmth that was no longer there. His hand found cold sheets. Not the kind of cool that meant she had risen early for her rounds at the infirmary, something she did often enough that he had grown accustomed to waking alone. This was a different kind of cold, the kind that settled into fabric when no one had touched it for hours. He opened his eyes. The room was still dark, dawn barely touching the edges of the curtains. Her boots were gone from their usual spot beside the door. The small cloth pouch she kept her hairpins in was missing from the table, and the faint, sweet scent of wildflower and crushed sage that followed her everywhere, that had seeped into his sheets and his clothes and somewhere beneath his own skin over the past 4 months, was already thinning in the air like smoke dissolving. Elowen? Silence. He checked the infirmary first. Empty. Her workbench had been cleaned and arranged with deliberate care, the mortar and pestle washed and set neatly on the shelf, as though she had tidied the space for someone else to inherit. Her herb pouch was gone. Her leather journal was gone. He checked her room. The door was unlocked. The bed was stripped to the bare mattress. The wardrobe held nothing but 2 wire hangers swaying gently in the draft from the hallway. And on the windowsill, placed precisely where she always kept it, was the silver hairpin he had commissioned for her from the mountain traders. The one shaped like a sprig of night bloom, because she had mentioned once that it was her favorite flower and he had remembered, because he remembered everything she ever said, every careless word, every quiet confession she scattered like seeds, without realizing he was gathering them all. She had left it behind. She had left behind the one thing that proved he had ever paid attention to her at all. The understanding hit him like a blade between the ribs. Not a morning errand. Not an overnight trip to gather herbs from the mountain ridge. She was gone. Deliberately, methodically, completely gone, and she had stripped away every trace of him from her life, as if he were a splinter she had finally pulled free. He broke the windowsill. He did not mean to. His hand closed around the edge of the wood, and it splintered under his grip with a crack so sharp that for one terrible moment it sounded like something inside his own chest snapping. Hadrian! His beta appeared within minutes, summoned by a roar that carried through 3 corridors and rattled the iron sconces in their brackets. He found his king standing in the center of an empty servant's room with wood embedded in his bleeding palm and an expression on his face that Hadrian, who had fought beside Soren in 2 border wars and watched him stare down an entire enemy line without blinking, had never once seen before. It was fear. "She's gone," Soren said. His voice was flat and dangerously controlled, pressed level under a weight that threatened to shatter it completely. "Elowen is gone." Hadrian did not ask who. He did not ask why. He had known about the king's visits to the infirmary for months, had watched from a careful distance as his oldest friend, who had not shown genuine warmth toward another living soul since his father died, began returning from those visits, looking almost like a man instead of a monument. "When?" Hadrian asked. "Sometime in the night. Her room is cleared out. There is no note." Hadrian took in the broken windowsill, the hairpin on the floor where it had fallen, the stripped mattress. He drew a slow, measured breath. "I'll alert the border patrols." "Alert everyone." Soren's eyes had gone black, not dark brown, not deepened by shadow. Black, the way an alpha's eyes turned when the wolf beneath the skin stopped pretending to be civilized. Every scout, every tracker, every patrol on every road from here to the Ashworth territories. She was on foot. She cannot have gone far. "Your Majesty, the engagement preparations require—" "Find her." The words came out low and vibrating, scraped from somewhere deep in his chest where his wolf was pacing in tight, frantic circles, slamming against the walls of his self-control. "I don't care what it costs. I don't care what it disrupts. Find her, Hadrian, or I will tear this kingdom apart stone by stone." Hadrian held his gaze for a long, still moment. Then he bowed and left the room at a pace just short of running. Soren stood alone in the stripped, silent space that still held the fading ghost of wildflower and sage. He pressed his hand flat against the bare mattress where she used to sleep, where she curled on her side with one hand tucked beneath her chin and her breathing slow and trusting in a way that destroyed him every time, because no one had ever felt safe enough in his presence to fall asleep beside him. No one had ever looked at what he was and decided he was worth trusting with something as fragile as unconsciousness. The engagement notice, the realization surfaced slowly, rising through the wreckage of his thoughts. He had approved the posting yesterday. He had signed the decree because the Ashworth alliance was necessary, and the kingdom's survival demanded sacrifices. And he had told himself that he would find a way to explain it to her afterward, that she would understand. He had not told her first. She had seen the notice. She had read those words and drawn the only conclusion a woman in her position could draw. That she was nothing. That what they had been in the dark didn't survive the daylight. And she had been wrong. But he had given her every reason to believe it, because he had never once told her what she was to him. He had let his silence speak, and his silence had said exactly the wrong thing. He picked the silver hairpin up from the floor. His fingers were bleeding from the splinters, and his blood smeared across the delicate metalwork and stained the tiny night bloom petals dark red. He did not put it down. The search for Elau Voss consumed the kingdom like a slow-burning fever. Within 3 days, Soren had deployed every tracker in the royal service across every road, every crossing, and every forest path between the capital and the northern border. Patrols tripled along the eastern and western routes. Her description was circulated to every inn, every market town, every healer's practice within 100 miles. A reward was posted discreetly, with no explanation beyond the words, "A missing member of the royal household, safe return requested." Hadrian coordinated the search with the grim efficiency of a military campaign, because that was precisely what it had become. But even his considerable resources could not cover the sheer scale of the territory. Ashenmere was vast, and the Green Vale Forest alone stretched for 70 miles, dense and poorly mapped in places, riddled with old trails that had not been charted since his grandfather's era. And Elau, as it turned out, had been paying far closer attention to the world than anyone had ever given her credit for. She had avoided every main road. She had traveled at night through stretches of the Green Vale that no one without a healer's knowledge of forest plants would have risked, foraging what she could and sleeping in shallow caves lined with pine boughs. By the time the first patrol reached the northern forest's edge, she was already miles beyond it. She surfaced in Carveth, a village so small and so far north that it did not appear on most official maps of the kingdom. It sat in a quiet valley between 2 granite ridges, accessible by a single road that flooded every spring and froze solid every winter. The kind of place people came to when they did not wish to be found. She gave her name as Wren. She found work with an elderly herbalist named Tamsin, a woman with steady hands and shrewd eyes who asked no questions about her new assistant's past and compensated her with meals and a dry room above the shop. Elau kept her head down. She wore her cloak loose. She told no one about the child. And she tried every single day, not to think about him. It did not work. The bond between them had been forming quietly for months, woven beneath the surface of every touch and every whispered conversation in the dark of the infirmary. Neither of them had acknowledged it. Neither of them had spoken its name. But it was there, threaded into the fabric of whatever they had built together like iron wire hidden inside silk, and now that she had torn herself away, it pulled. She felt it constantly. A low, persistent ache deep in her chest that sharpened whenever she was tired or cold or afraid. A restless heat beneath her skin that no tonic could ease. She dreamed of him every night, vivid and merciless, his voice calling her name from somewhere just beyond reach, and she woke with her hand pressed against her chest as though she could hold the pain in place by force. She told herself it would fade. That bonds weakened with distance and time. Everyone knew that. If she stayed away long enough, the thread between them would thin and finally snap, and she would be free to build a life that did not revolve around a man who had chosen a throne over her heartbeat. She was wrong about that too. Back at the palace, the deterioration was impossible to ignore. Soren had stopped sleeping. Not merely reduced his rest, he had simply stopped. His eyes were shadowed and hollow. His temper became volatile and corrosive. He dismissed council meetings after minutes and snarled at advisors who brought him anything unrelated to the search. The engagement preparations continued around him like scenery in a play he had stopped watching. Lysara Ashworth remained at the palace, composed and unflinching, conducting herself with quiet dignity. In private, speaking to Hadrian with a candor that startled him, she said, "He is searching for someone. I am not fool enough to pretend it is me." Hadrian neither confirmed nor denied it. Weeks passed. The scouts returned one by one, empty-handed. No sighting, no trail, no whisper of a young herbalist matching her description within 150 miles. Lauenvoss had vanished as completely as though the earth had swallowed her whole. And Soren was becoming something that frightened even Hadrian. The wolf was closer to the surface now than it had been in years. His movements were sharper, his silences heavier. His presence in a room pressing down on everyone in it with a weight that made seasoned warriors drop their eyes. He was not grieving. Grief was passive. What Soren was doing was hunting, and the longer the hunt went unanswered, the more dangerous the hunter became. Then, on a freezing night 6 weeks after her disappearance, Elowyn felt the baby move for the first time. She was lying in her narrow bed above Tamsin's shop, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, which had grown visible enough now that she had needed to let out the seams of her only remaining dress. The flutter came without warning, a tiny, impossible stirring deep inside her, like a bird testing its wings beneath her skin, and her breath caught, and her eyes filled and her palm pressed down gently as if to answer. "I feel you. I am here." And then the bond surged. It ripped through her chest like a wire pulled taut and released all at once, a wave of heat and longing and desperate clawing anguish that did not belong to her. It was his. Soren's grief and rage and aching, bottomless need, transmitted across 200 miles of forest and stone and silence, amplified by the child they had made together, the child whose small, flickering heartbeat had just announced itself to both of them simultaneously. Elowyn pressed her face into the pillow and bit down on the fabric to muffle the sound that tore out of her. Because she knew, with a certainty that went deeper than medicine or logic or anything she had ever been taught, that 200 miles away, the Alpha King of Ashenmere had just felt his child move for the first time. And whatever fragile wall she had built between her old life and her new one had just cracked straight down the center. Era found the evidence 3 days later. She had been reorganizing the infirmary supply shelves, a task she undertook every autumn with the ruthless precision of a woman who considered disorder in a medicine cabinet to be a personal, moral failing. She was cataloging the tincture inventory when she noticed it. A gap on the shelf where the prenatal compounds were stored. One vial of iron root strengthening tonic was missing from its labeled position. And beside the gap, barely visible against the dark wood of the shelf, was a faint blue residue. Moonwort and crushed iron filings. The old testing compound. Era stood very still for a long time, staring at that blue stain with the expression of a woman rearranging every assumption she had held for the past 6 weeks. Then she sat down heavily on the workbench stool and pressed her fingers against her temples and closed her eyes for a very long moment. She went to the king within the hour. She found him in his study, a room that had transformed into a war room. Maps covered every surface. Routes were traced in red ink. Scout reports lay in disordered piles. The entire space was the physical manifestation of obsession. Soren looked up when she entered. He had not slept in what appeared to be several days. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw dark with stubble, his shirt unchanged for days. "I need to speak with you," Era said. She closed the door. "About Elowyn." His expression sharpened instantly, like a blade brought to a whetstone. "You found her?" "No." Era sat down across from him without being invited, in the manner of a woman who had known him since he was an infant running fevers and screaming about taking his medicine. "But I have found something that changes what you should be looking for." She placed the empty tonic vial on the desk between them. The faint blue stain was still visible on the glass. "This was missing from my prenatal supply shelf, the stock I keep specifically for women in early pregnancy, and beside the empty space I found residue of a moonwort and iron testing compound." She paused, giving the words room to land. "She brewed a pregnancy test, Your Majesty, and she took the prenatal tonic with her when she left." The silence that followed had physical weight. It pressed against the walls and flattened the air in the room until breathing felt like pushing through deep water. Soren stared at the vial. His expression did not change. His body did not move, but something behind his eyes collapsed, slowly and entirely, like a structure that had been holding itself upright by sheer force of will and had finally encountered the one fracture it could not withstand. She was... He stopped. The word refused to form. "Pregnant," Era finished, because someone had to speak it into existence. "Based on the timing, I estimate she was approximately 3 to 4 months along when she disappeared. She would be approaching 6 months now." 6 months. His child had been alive for 6 months, and he had not known. She had carried this alone, alongside the engagement notice and the silence he had offered where words should have been, and she had walked into the frost with his air beneath her heart, and not a single person in the world to help her. "She did not leave because she stopped caring about you," Era said, her voice quiet but unbending, the tone she used when delivering diagnoses that patients needed to hear, whether they wanted to or not. "She left because she believed you would never choose her, and she refused to let her child be raised as a secret." Soren's fingers closed around the empty vial. His knuckles went white. "She would have needed continued care," he said, and his voice had changed. It was lower now, rougher, scraped raw by something that had torn through the grief and the guilt and the rage, and arrived at a place beyond all three. Prenatal herbs. A midwife or a healer with knowledge of wolf pregnancies. Someone she could trust. Era nodded slowly. She would. But she would have avoided any town large enough that someone might recognize her. The northern route through the Green Vale leads to 4, perhaps 5 villages with resident healers. If she kept to the forest paths, the most likely destination would be a valley settlement beyond the northern ridge. Carveth, Dunmore, possibly Ellenwick. Soren rose from his chair. The map on the wall behind him showed the northern territories in close detail, every trail and ridgeline and river crossing drawn in meticulous ink. His eyes moved across it with the focused, predatory intensity of a hunter who had finally caught a scent after weeks of searching blind. "Prepare a riding party," he said to Hadrian, who had materialized silently in the doorway without being summoned. drawn there by the same instinct that had kept him at Soren's side for 15 years. Small, fast. No banners, no royal insignia. We leave before dawn. You're going yourself, Hadrian said. It was not a question. She is carrying my child. Soren's voice broke on the final word, the first visible crack in his composure since the morning he had woken to an empty bed and a cold room and a silver hairpin abandoned on a windowsill like a farewell. She left because I failed her. I will not send a stranger to repair what I destroyed. He turned to Heir. The bond, the pregnancy, the distance between us. How much danger is she in? Tell me the truth, and do not soften it. Heir met his gaze without flinching. The bond between a mated pair is designed to sustain both partners. When one half is removed, the other weakens. When you add a pregnancy to that equation, a child carrying both bloodlines, actively amplifying the connection while its parents are separated. She paused, and for the first time her composure flickered. She is strong, Your Majesty, stronger than you know. But strength has limits, and so does time. Soren looked at the map. Then he looked at the silver hairpin he still carried in his coat pocket, blood-stained and bent at the stem where his grip had warped the metal. Then, we ride tonight. Soren found her on the 5th day. The riding party had split into 3 groups at the northern ridge, each taking a different valley route toward the scattered settlements Heir had identified. Soren took the western path toward Carveth with Hadrian and 2 scouts, following a thread of information from a trader who remembered selling dried ginger root to a young woman with dark hair and a healer's knowledge at the Carveth market 3 weeks earlier. The village was small enough to walk across in 10 minutes. He did not need to search it. He felt her the moment he passed the boundary stones. The bond, which had been a constant, excruciating pull behind his ribs for weeks, suddenly blazed white-hot, sharp and certain and overwhelming, like a compass needle slamming north after spinning aimlessly for months. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and walked toward the small herbalist shop on the village's only paved road, as though something had hooked into his chest and was reeling him forward hand over hand. She was standing behind the counter with her back to the door, wrapping bundles of dried thyme with twine. Her hair was longer, pulled into a loose braid that hung between her shoulder blades. Her posture was different, straighter, harder. She carried herself with a quiet, fierce composure that belonged to someone who had learned to stand alone and refused to apologize for it. And she was unmistakably, visibly pregnant. The swell of her belly pressed against the fabric of a simple wool dress, round and full and real in a way that knocked the air from his lungs more completely than any blow he had ever taken in combat. His child. That was his child, alive and growing and sheltered inside the body of the woman he had driven away through silence and cowardice, and the catastrophic arrogance of believing he could keep her without ever telling her she was kept. Eowyn. She went rigid, her hands stilled on the twine. She did not turn around for a very long time, long enough for him to see the tension climb her spine one vertebra at a time, long enough for the silence between them to harden into something sharp enough to cut. When she finally turned, her face was calm. Perfectly, terrifyingly calm, the way a frozen lake looks calm, while the water beneath it churns. "You should not be here," she said. "You should not have had to leave." And yet I did. Her eyes dropped to his riding clothes, his dust-covered boots, the evidence of days of hard travel. Then they moved to Hadrian, standing in the doorway behind him. "You brought soldiers to a village of 40 people. I brought 2 scouts and the only man I trust. To do what exactly? Drag me back to the palace so I can watch your wedding from the servants' corridor?" The words landed like thrown stones, each one precise and deliberate, and aimed at the softest places she knew he had. She had always known where he was soft. He had shown her every unguarded place he possessed, and now those same vulnerabilities were being used as entry points for her anger, and he could not even blame her for it because he had earned every single syllable. "There is no wedding," he said. She stared at him. Her calm flickered, just barely, a hairline fracture running through the ice. The engagement notice was posted before I could speak to you. I signed the decree because the council required it, and the alliance demanded it, and I was a fool who believed I had more time than I did. He took a step closer. She took a step back. The counter stood between them like a barricade. I have not slept since you left. I have not eaten a full meal. I have not drawn a breath that did not feel like inhaling broken glass. And I have spent every waking moment since you left tearing my kingdom apart looking for you. So when I tell you there is no wedding, Elowen, I need you to hear me. She heard him. He could see it in the way her jaw tightened and her eyes brightened with something she was fighting desperately to contain. But she did not move toward him. She placed one hand on the curve of her belly and lifted her chin. You are engaged to Lysara Ashworth. The notice bears your seal. The kingdom expects a bonding ceremony on the frost moon. And I am a nameless healer carrying a king's child, a king who never once mentioned my existence to another living soul. Her voice did not waver. Go home, Soren. Marry your alliance. Your child will be fine without your name attached to it. She turned her back on him and resumed wrapping the thyme, as if the Alpha King of Ashenmere were not standing in a village herbalist shop with his chest torn open and every wound visible. He did not leave. He stayed in Carveth. Hadrian secured a room at the village's only lodging house, a narrow building that doubled as a tavern and smelled permanently of wood smoke and boiled turnips. The two scouts were sent back to the palace with instructions to halt the search and deliver a sealed letter to the council. Soren did not tell Hadrian what the letter contained. Elowen refused to speak to him for 3 days. She went about her work as though he did not exist. She opened the shop each morning at dawn, treated villagers who came for remedies, helped Tamsin prepare tinctures and poultices, and closed the shutters each evening without once glancing at the tall, dark-haired man who sat on the bench across the road with the patient, unmoving intensity of a wolf who had found what he was tracking and would not be moved by weather or time or the stubborn fury of the woman he had come for. The village noticed. Of course it did. 40 people could not fail to notice a stranger of his size and bearing sitting vigil outside the herbalist shop day after day. Tamsin, who had survived 7 decades by minding her own business, broke her own rule on the 3rd evening. The man across the road, she said to Elowen as they were closing up, he is the father. It was not a question. Elowen's hands tightened on the shutter latch. It doesn't matter who he is. It matters to the child, Tamsin said mildly, and it matters to your body. You look worse every day, girl. The circles under your eyes are darker than his, and that is saying something considering he appears to have not slept since last season. She was right, and Elowen knew it. The pregnancy was becoming harder. Not in the ordinary ways she had prepared for, not the aches and fatigue and shifting balance. Harder in a way that hummed beneath the surface, a deep, resonant wrongness that she felt in her bones. The baby was restless, constantly shifting, constantly pressing, as though it could feel its father's proximity and was straining toward him. And the bond, which she had spent weeks trying to starve into silence, had roared back to life the moment Soren set foot in Carveth and was now a constant, deafening presence in her chest that made her dizzy if she stood too quickly and woke her 3 times every night with his emotions bleeding into her dreams. She was weakening. She could measure it in the tremor of her hands, the breathlessness that came from climbing a single flight of stairs, the way her vision sometimes blurred at the edges for no medical reason she could identify. On the 4th morning, she opened the shop and found him already there. Not on the bench across the road. Standing at her door holding a clay pot of soup that smelled like ginger and chicken broth. Tamsin told me you haven't been eating, he said. Tamsin should mind her own business. She also told me the pregnancy is struggling, that the baby's heartbeat is irregular and your blood pressure drops every afternoon. Elowen's composure broke. She had no right to tell you that. She had every right. She is your healer, and she is frightened for you. His voice was low and raw and stripped of every defense she had ever seen him wear. "I am frightened for you. Please, Elowin, whatever you decide about me, about us, I will accept it. But let me stay close enough to keep you both alive. The bond is not a choice. The child is drawing from both of us, and the distance is starving it. You know this. You are a healer. You know exactly what is happening." She did know. She had known for weeks, had tracked her own declining vitals with the same clinical precision she applied to every patient, and had watched the numbers move in directions that terrified her. The baby needed both parents in proximity. The bond demanded it, and her stubborn, wounded pride was putting her child at risk. She took the soup. She did not invite him inside, but she sat on the step outside the shop, and he sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and the bond between them hummed and settled into something quieter and steadier, like a frantic heartbeat slowly finding its rhythm. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The warmth between them, even damaged, even fractured by silence and fear and weeks of separation, was doing what words could not. The baby stilled. Her hands stopped trembling. And for the first time since she had left the palace, the dizziness receded, and she could breathe without feeling like she was drowning. She hated how much she needed him. She hated that her body knew things her heart refused to accept. But when he came back the next morning with more soup, she opened the door. The riders arrived in Carveth on a gray morning 5 days after Sorin, and they were not friendly. There were 6 of them, wearing no identifying colors, carrying weapons that were too fine for bandits and too discreet for a formal delegation. They rode into the village without announcement and spread out along the main road with the methodical precision of men who had done this kind of work before. Hadrian spotted them first. He was at Sorin's side within seconds, his voice low and urgent. "Ashworth men. I recognize the lead rider. He commands Lord Ashworth's personal guard." Sorin's expression didn't change, but something beneath it went very still. Very cold. "They followed us." "They followed the scouts, most likely. We sent them back with a visible trail. If Ashworth has people watching the northern roads, they would have intercepted the route easily." "What do they want?" Hadrian hesitated. That alone told Sorin everything he needed to know, because Hadrian did not hesitate. "If Lord Ashworth has learned about the pregnancy," Hadrian said carefully, "then he knows an illegitimate heir threatens the value of the marriage alliance. A child with Valdric blood, born outside the engagement, gives the crown an alternative succession path. The engagement becomes optional. The Ashworth family's leverage disappears. They've come to threaten her. They've come to assess the situation. What they do next depends on what they find." Sorin looked across the road at the herbalist shop where Elowin was working. Through the window, he could see her bending over the counter, her braid falling forward, one hand resting on the shelf for balance, because the dizziness still caught her when she moved too quickly. She did not know the riders were here. She did not know that the political machinery she had fled from had followed her to this tiny village at the edge of the world and was now standing in the street with swords on their hips. "Stay with her," Sorin told Hadrian, "inside the shop. Do not leave her side. And you? I am going to have a conversation." He met the lead rider in the center of the road. The man was weathered and professional, a career soldier with careful eyes and a posture that suggested he had been given instructions he intended to follow precisely. "Your Majesty." He inclined his head with the minimum courtesy required. "Lord Ashworth sends his regards and requests clarification regarding certain rumors that have reached the Eastern Reach." "Rumors? Regarding a woman? And a child?" Sorin studied the man for a long, silent moment. Behind him, he heard Hadrian enter the herbalist shop. He heard Elowin's voice, confused, asking what was happening. He heard Hadrian's low reply, and then silence. "Tell Lord Ashworth," Sorin said, and his voice was quiet in the way that made experienced soldiers take a half step back without meaning to, "that the woman's name is Elowin. that the child she carries is mine, and that any person who threatens either of them, directly or by implication, will answer to me personally in a manner that will make Lord Ashworth regret the day he decided that my family was a political chess piece. The lead writer's composure held, but barely. Your Majesty, the engagement is a matter I will address with Lord Ashworth directly, not through armed men sent to intimidate a pregnant woman in a village that has done nothing to deserve soldiers on its only road. He stepped closer. The rider's horse shifted nervously. You will leave Carveth within the hour. You will report what I have said exactly as I have said it. And you will make it absolutely clear that the next person Lord Ashworth sends in my direction had better be a diplomat, because if it is another squad of armed men, I will treat it as an act of war. The riders left within 40 minutes. Elawan was standing in the shop doorway when he walked back, Hadrian behind her. Her face was pale and her hand was pressed against her belly, and her eyes were wide with a fear he had never seen in them before. Who were they? She asked. No one who will bother you again. Soren, who were they? He met her eyes. Ashworth's men. They came because of the baby. They left because I told them what would happen if they stayed. Her mouth opened, closed. Her hand pressed harder against her belly, protective and instinctive. This is what I was afraid of, she whispered. This is exactly what I was afraid of. The baby makes me a target. The baby makes us both. The baby makes you the mother of my heir, Soren said, and his voice held something she had not heard in it before. Not the controlled authority of a king, not the raw desperation of the man who had begged her to eat soup on a doorstep. Something fiercer than both. Something that sounded like a vow. And I will burn the Ashworth alliance, the eastern border, and every political arrangement I have ever made before I let anyone touch you or our child. She stared at him, and for the first time since he had arrived in Carveth, the ice behind her eyes cracked all the way through. That night, she let him inside. Not into the shop. Into the small room above it where she had been living since she arrived in Carveth, with its narrow bed and its single window and the shelf lined with the prenatal tonics she brewed each morning. The room smelled like dried herbs and candle wax and her, and when Soren stepped through the door, his wolf went quiet for the first time in weeks. Not calm, not peaceful. Just quiet, the way a creature goes still when it has finally found the place it belongs. She sat on the edge of the bed. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up, maintaining the distance she needed while staying close enough that the bond could do its work. The baby settled almost immediately, the restless shifting easing into something gentler as both parents' proximity anchored the connection. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Elowen said, without looking at him, I heard you that night. In the corridor outside the infirmary, you told Hadrian there were no personal matters, only the kingdom. Soren closed his eyes. I know, he said. I know you heard that. And I know what it sounded like. It sounded like I was nothing to you. Yes, it did. He opened his eyes. But you left before I finished. The next thing I said to Hadrian after you walked away was that I needed to find a way out of the engagement, that I could not stand beside Lysara Ashworth and speak bonding vows when every part of me, every cell, every breath, every thought I'd had for 4 months, belonged to a woman who smelled like sage and laughed at her own jokes, and had never once in her life asked anyone for more than she thought she deserved. The silence that followed was fragile, like glass held in shaking hands. You were going to break the engagement, she whispered. I was trying to find a way. The alliance, the border, the political consequences. I was trying to solve all of it so that when I came to you, I could come with clean hands and tell you that I had chosen you without conditions, without risk, without asking you to sacrifice anything. His jaw tightened. I wanted to be worthy of you before I asked you to stay. And by the time I realized that what you actually needed was not perfection but honesty, you were already gone. Eowyn pressed her fingers against her eyes. Her shoulders shook once, then stilled. My parents left me on the infirmary steps when I was less than a day old, she said. Her voice was barely audible. No note, no name, not even a blanket with a family thread woven in. Just an unmarked wool blanket and a baby who was not worth keeping. He did not speak. He did not move. He listened the way he had always listened to her, with his entire body, as though her words were the most important thing happening in the world. I spent my whole life believing that if I was quiet enough and small enough and useful enough, someone might decide I was worth keeping. Her voice cracked, and then you happened. And you made me feel, for the first time in my life, like I was not just enough, but extraordinary. Like I was the only person in a room that you could see. She looked at him. Her eyes were wet, but her gaze was steady. And then I read that notice. And every single thing I had ever believed about being disposable came crashing back. Because of course you would choose someone else. That is what people do. They leave. They look at me and decide I am not quite worth the trouble. Eowyn. I didn't leave because I was angry, she said. I left because I believed you. Not the notice. Not the politics. I believed the story I had been telling myself for 23 years, that I would always be the one people walked away from. And I could survive that for myself. I have been surviving it my whole life, but I could not survive it for my child. I could not watch my baby learn that same lesson. Soren was on his feet before he fully realized he had moved. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her and took her hands, which were trembling, and held them between his own, which were also trembling, and looked up at her with an expression that contained nothing strategic and nothing controlled, and nothing that resembled the armored, untouchable king she had first met in the infirmary on a spring night that felt like 100 years ago. My father loved my mother more than he loved the kingdom, he said. And the kingdom suffered for it. Alliances frayed. The council lost faith. And when she died, he collapsed so completely that the crown nearly fell with him. His voice was rough. I was 17. I watched it happen. And I swore, the day they put his crown on my head, that I would never let love make me weak. He pressed his forehead against her joined hands. And then you sat in your infirmary at midnight and told me the wound didn't care who I was, and I was lost. Completely and irreversibly lost, Eowyn, and I have been trying to outrun it ever since because I was terrified that choosing you would make me my father. He lifted his head. His eyes were bright. But losing you cost me more. It cost me everything that mattered. And the kingdom suffered anyway, because a king who cannot sleep or eat or think clearly is no king at all. My father's mistake was not loving my mother. His mistake was believing that love and duty could not exist in the same man. And my mistake was inheriting that belief and letting it destroy the only thing I have ever wanted for myself. Eowyn pulled one hand free and pressed it against his cheek. His eyes closed at the contact, and the sound he made was so quiet and so broken that it undid every remaining wall she had. I should have told you, he whispered. Every day, every night, I should have told you what you are to me, not in the dark, not in secret, in front of every person in that palace, in front of the council and the court and the entire kingdom. You are not a personal matter to be managed. You are the reason I am still breathing, and our child will never, not for one single day of its life, wonder whether it was worth keeping. I swear it. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, and the bond between them flared so bright that for a moment the room seemed to hum with it, a resonance that radiated outward through the walls and into the cold night air. Don't you ever keep something from me again, she said. Never. And don't you ever sign a document that involves our future without talking to me first. Never again. And if you ever call what we have a personal matter in that flat, diplomatic voice, I will put something extremely unpleasant in your evening tea." He laughed. A real laugh, startled and rough and wet at the edges. And then she was laughing too, helplessly, with tears still tracking down her face, and he pulled her into him as close as the belly between them allowed and held her with the desperate, shaking grip of a man who had just been handed back the thing he thought he had lost forever. The baby kicked, hard, right against the place where their bodies pressed together, and they both felt it. Both went still, and then Soren made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite a sob, and pressed his palm flat against the swell of her stomach, and held it there like he was making a promise directly to the child. "I am here. I am not leaving. Neither of us is leaving ever again." The letter from Lysara Ashworth arrived in Carveth 4 days later, carried by a single rider bearing the jade and iron colors of the Eastern Reach. Hadrian brought it to Soren in the herbalist shop, where he had been spending his mornings helping Tamsin organize inventory with the same strategic focus he once applied to military campaigns, except directed at alphabetizing dried plants. Elowin found it quietly hilarious and did not tell him so, which was itself a form of tenderness. The letter was brief. Lysara's handwriting was clean and sharp, every stroke deliberate. "Your Majesty, I have received your rider's account of the situation in the north, alongside a separate and considerably more diplomatic account from your man Hadrian, who I suspect has been quietly managing your more combustible decisions for years. I am releasing you from the engagement. Not because you asked, and not because your rather theatrical threat to my father's guard was convincing, although I will admit it was entertaining. I am releasing you because I have spent enough time in your palace to understand that you are never going to be fully present at any altar that did not include the woman you actually love. A marriage alliance built on one partner's visible misery is not an alliance. It is a hostage situation. The border will need to be addressed through other means. I trust you are competent enough to find them. I wish your healer well. She will need patience. You are not an easy man. Lysara." Soren read the letter twice, then handed it to Elowin without a word. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she looked up at him with an expression that was half disbelief and half something much warmer. "I think I would have liked her," she said quietly. "She would have terrified you," Soren replied. "Most worthwhile people do." The formal dissolution of the engagement reached the palace by courier within the week. The council reacted with predictable alarm. Soren addressed them through a letter dictated to Hadrian and dispatched from Carveth, because he refused to leave Elowin's side until she was strong enough to travel. He proposed a revised treaty with the Eastern Reach, based on trade terms rather than marriage, offering mineral rights to the crown's northern deposits in exchange for continued military cooperation. It was a concession that would have been unthinkable 3 months ago. It was also, as Hadrian pointed out privately, a better long-term arrangement, because trade partnerships survived changes in leadership, while marriage alliances died with the people who made them. Elowin listened to all of it from the chair by the shop window, where Soren had insisted she rest every afternoon. She listened to him negotiate the future of a kingdom from a village herbalist shop, and she thought that the man who had terrified her that first night in the infirmary was the same man who brought her soup on a doorstep, and once, when he thought no one was watching, pressed his ear against her belly and whispered something to the baby that made his whole body go still with a tenderness so raw it hurt to witness. He had chosen her, not in the dark, not in secret, in front of his council, his kingdom, his most powerful ally, and the entire political apparatus that had been designed to keep them apart. He had chosen her, and it had cost him dearly, and he had not flinched. The bond between them, freed from the strangling distance and the weight of secrets, settled into something luminous and steady. The baby's heartbeat stabilized. Elowin's blood pressure returned to normal. The dizziness vanished. The color came back to her face, and to his. And Tamsin observed to Hadrian over tea one evening that the pair of them looked like two plants that someone had finally remembered to water. Romantic, Hadrian said dryly. Accurate, Tamsin corrected him. When Elowin was strong enough, they rode south together. Slowly, over 4 days with frequent stops. Sorin kept his horse beside hers and matched her pace exactly, and did not once suggest they move faster. Hadrian rode behind them and pretended not to notice the number of times the king reached across the gap between their horses to touch her hand. They entered the palace through the main gate. Not the servants' passage, not a side entrance. The main gate, in full daylight, with the court watching from the windows and the guards standing at attention, and Elowin sitting upright on her horse with her belly round and visible, and her chin lifted and her hand resting on the place where the next heir to the kingdom of Ashenmere was currently, by the feel of it, practicing combat drills against her bladder. Sorin dismounted first and offered her his hand in front of every person who had ever whispered that the king would never take a mate, that he was too cold, too controlled, too committed to duty to allow himself something as dangerous as love. She took his hand. She swung down from the horse. And the Alpha King of Ashenmere, who had not shown public affection toward another person in the entirety of his reign, tucked her against his side and walked her through the palace doors as though she had always belonged there. Because she had. The child arrived on the first night of the frost moon, the same date the engagement ceremony had originally been planned. Elowin appreciated the irony. Sorin did not find it funny, largely because he spent the entire labor pacing the corridor outside the birthing chamber with an expression that made the palace guards seriously consider requesting a transfer to a less terrifying post. Heir delivered the baby. A girl, small and fierce, with her mother's dark hair and her father's unsettling habit of staring at people as though she could see directly through them. They named her Aelith. It meant first light in the old tongue, because she arrived at dawn and because Elowin said she wanted their daughter's name to mean something about beginnings rather than endings. Sorin held his daughter for the first time in the quiet of the morning, sitting on the edge of the bed beside Elowin with the baby cradled against his chest and his face wearing an expression that Hadrian, watching from the doorway, had never seen on any human being before. It was not quite joy. It was something bigger and more terrifying than joy. It was the face of a man who had just discovered that his heart had been living outside his body this whole time and was now 6 pounds of fury wrapped in a cotton blanket. The kingdom adjusted. Not easily, not smoothly, and not without court gossip that Elowin weathered with the calm pragmatism of a woman who had survived alone in the northern wilderness while pregnant and was not about to be undone by whispers at a banquet table. The trade alliance with the Eastern Reach held. Lysara Ashworth, in a move that surprised no one who actually knew her, negotiated terms that were more favorable to both territories than the original marriage arrangement would have been. She sent a gift when the baby was born, a tiny silver pendant shaped like a night bloom, with a note that read simply, "For the girl who was worth a kingdom. Welcome." Elowin hung it above the crib and did not cry, although it was, she admitted later, a very near thing. Months passed. The bond deepened. The nightmares that had plagued Sorin since his father's death grew less frequent, then rare, then almost entirely absent. He slept now, properly, deeply, the way a person sleeps when they have stopped carrying the weight of the world alone. And on quiet nights, when the palace was still and the baby was sleeping and the fire burned low in the chamber they shared, Elowin would lie beside him and watch his face and think about how strange it was that the most powerful man in the kingdom looked most like himself when he was unconscious, that the version of him she loved best was this one, unguarded, breathing slowly, his hand resting on the mattress between them, as though even in sleep he was reaching for her. She had spent 23 years believing she was not worth keeping. She had been wrong. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since a girl with no name was left on an infirmary doorstep in the dark, she slept without fear. beside a man who had chosen her in the light, in a home that was finally, unquestionably, hers.